It was the summer of 2010. My parents had decided that I needed to spend more time outdoors, so they enrolled me in a 2-week program at Camp Ernst, a massive, heavily forested sleepaway camp. Thankfully, they allowed my best friend Keith to tag along, sparing me the anxiety of being entirely alone among strangers. The camp itself looked like a movie set for a classic 80s slasher film. There were 2 main, sprawling wooden cabins, one for the boys and one for the girls, separated by a large clearing. In the center stood a massive lodge that served as the dining hall and activity center, surrounded by miles of dense, impenetrable woods. Keith and I were notorious night owls. While the other campers were exhausted from hiking and swimming, we would stay up late. We had smuggled our Nintendo DS consoles into the cabin and would play multiplayer games hidden beneath our blankets. One particular night, we pushed our luck further than usual. That is, it was past 2 a.m. The entire cabin was filled with the rhythmic, heavy breathing of sleeping kids. The only light came from the dim, glowing screens of our consoles. Suddenly, the heavy silence was broken by the sharp, distinct creak of the cabin's front door slowly swinging open. Panic immediately spiked in my chest. Assuming it was a counselor doing a late-night bed check, Keith and I violently shoved our consoles under our pillows, squeezed our eyes shut, and desperately tried to fake the deep, even breathing of sleep. But it wasn't a counselor. Through my barely opened eyelashes, I saw a dark, ambiguous silhouette standing in the doorway. Then, the heavy, deliberate footsteps began. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy boots walked past the empty beds at the front, bypassing the counselor's cots entirely. The figure stopped right next to Keith's bed. I held my breath, waiting for a flashlight beam or a scolding voice. Neither came. After a few agonizing seconds, the heavy footsteps moved from Keith's bed and slowly stopped right next to mine. I was paralyzed with fear. I squeezed my eyes shut so tight they hurt. Then I felt it. The unmistakable, sickeningly warm sensation of someone leaning down and exhaling heavily against the bare skin of my neck. It wasn't just a draft. It was the deliberate, hot breath of a living person. My blood ran completely cold. A moment later, the figure straightened up. The heavy footsteps retreated down the wooden aisle and the front door clicked shut. I instantly sat up, gasping for air. I looked over at Keith, who was already sitting up, his face pale in the moonlight. "That was terrifying," I whispered, my voice trembling. Whoever that was, they literally breathed on my neck. Assuming it was just a bizarre, inappropriate prank by one of the older counselors, we nervously pulled our consoles back out to distract ourselves. Just as I turned my screen on, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden bed frame. I picked it up. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why are you two still up?" My stomach completely dropped. At the beginning of camp, those of us with cell phones were given a printed list of emergency counselor numbers. I knew this number wasn't on that list. Terrified, my thumbs flew across the keypad. "Who is this?" I sent back. No response. I showed the screen to Keith, who didn't own a phone. He looked horrified. "Looks like..." We rationalized that it had to be a counselor playing a cruel joke, so we lowered the brightness on our screens to the absolute minimum and tried to ignore it. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden back door of the cabin groaned open. We didn't even hesitate. The consoles flew under the pillows again. But this time, there were no footsteps. Just a terrifying heavy silence. My phone vibrated again. Another text from the same unknown number. It's Counselor Tony. Come outside to the back of the cabin. I have something to say to you. I stared at the glowing screen. Keith violently shook his head. Don't do it, he whispered. That sounds way too suspicious. We both realized that whoever Tony was, they were currently standing just a few feet away holding the back door open. Fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and absolute dread, I decided to peek. I silently slipped out of bed, creeping barefoot into the center aisle, where I had a clear line of sight down the dark hallway to the screen door at the back of the cabin. Keith violently grabbed my shirt, begging me to stay, but I pushed forward. As I crept closer to the back exit, the moonlight revealed a horrifying detail. The wooden paneling next to the door was slightly caved in, creating a small, shadowy alcove. Someone was crouched inside that alcove. I took one more step. The moonlight shifted, illuminating the face of the intruder. It wasn't a camp counselor, it wasn't a teenager. It was a deeply weathered, dirty, incredibly old man, staring back at me with wide, crazed eyes. I just reacted. I spun around and sprinted, screaming at the top of my "Help us!" The entire cabin erupted, waking up crying, and turned over the commotion. I heard the slam shut into the night, rushed in through the front door. I hysterically, they in lockdown, along the perimeter with head. But it was useless. The camp was surrounded by forest. Defining part of the story is I have Nan got my specific, knew exactly I didn't think. I will never forget my time at a secluded sleepaway camp nestled deep in the Pennsylvania woods. As a young child, I was painfully shy and introverted. The loud, chaotic orientation on the first day was absolute torture. I would have traded anything to be safely back home, playing my Super Nintendo. While the other kids formed rapid, loud friendships, I stood awkwardly in the corner. Fortunately, an incredibly outgoing, boisterous kid decided to adopt me. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Mike. He was a short, energetic, blonde kid who religiously wore a faded Yankees cap. At the time, I thought he was the coolest person I had ever met. Looking back, he was definitely the prototype for the rebellious high school punk who constantly gets into trouble. During our mandatory tour of the sprawling campgrounds, Mike and I noticed something strange. Far off the main path, partially hidden by overgrown thorn bushes and decaying trees, stood an isolated, rotting cabin. It looked completely abandoned, its paint peeling and its windows dark. Curious, we broke away from the group and asked a young counselor about it. He shrugged nervously. "I have no idea," he muttered. "It's my first week here. All I know is that they haven't used that building in years. We aren't supposed to go near it." That was all Mike needed to hear. The mystery became an obsession. On the final night of camp, the air was thick with excitement and exhaustion. The counselors had performed their final bed checks, and the cabin was settling into darkness. Just as I was drifting off, Mike crept over to my bunk and violently whispered in my ear. He wanted to sneak out. He wanted to explore the abandoned cabin in the dark. Every logical instinct in my brain screamed no. I was terrified of getting caught, terrified of the dark, and terrified of what might be in that rotting building. But my desperate desire to seem cool and impress Mike overrode my common sense. I reluctantly agreed. We waited an agonizing 30 minutes until we were absolutely certain the counselors in the neighboring lodge were deeply asleep. Then we quietly slipped out the back door into the freezing night air. My heart hammered against my ribs like a jackhammer. We sprinted silently across the damp grass, keeping to the heavy shadows of the trees until we reached the decaying structure. Up close, it looked even more menacing. The heavy wooden front door was aggressively boarded up with thick planks and rusted nails. "Look," Mike whispered, pointing to the side of the building. One of the massive glass windows was completely shattered, leaving a jagged, gaping hole large enough to crawl through. Mike went first, effortlessly hoisting himself over the sill. I followed, carefully avoiding the sharp shards of glass sticking out of the wooden frame. The inside of the abandoned cabin was suffocatingly dark. The air was freezing cold and smelled heavily of damp rot and mildew. These weren't small shacks. They were massive dormitories built to hold at least 10 campers. With no flashlights, we were completely blind. We held our arms out in front of us, shuffling slowly to avoid tripping over debris. Bang! I walked directly into the heavy metal frame of an old bunk bed, rubbing my bruised knee. I heard Mike curse softly as he bumped into something else nearby. I paused, straining my ears in the pitch black. Squeak, creak, squeak. It was the distinct rhythmic sound of old, rusty springs violently compressing. Someone was rhythmically bouncing up and down on one of the mattresses. "Stop messing around, Mike," I hissed, annoyed that he was trying to scare me. "You're gonna break it and make too much noise." The bouncing didn't stop. It actually grew louder, more aggressive. Then Mike's voice echoed from the complete opposite side of the massive room. "Dude, that's not me. I thought that was you." My blood turned to ice. My stomach completely hollowed out. We were standing blind in a pitch-black, locked, abandoned building in the middle of the woods, and something heavy was aggressively jumping on a bed right next to us. We didn't say another word. Pure primal terror took over. We both lunged blindly in toward the faint moonlight outlining the broken window. Because the window was elevated and jagged, we had to scramble out one at a time. Mike managed to pull himself through. I was right behind him, my hands gripping the wooden sill. Suddenly, the violent squeaking behind me abruptly stopped. Thud. A massive, heavy weight hit the rotting floorboards. Whatever was jumping on the bed had just jumped off. Panic consumed me. I threw my upper body through the window frame, kicking my legs wildly. Just as my waist cleared the sill, I felt it. Two massive, incredibly cold hands closed violently around my left ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically with my free leg. The hands tightened, desperately trying to yank me back down into the pitch-black cabin. With a final adrenaline-fueled burst of strength, I kicked blindly into the dark, feeling my heel connect with something solid. The grip loosened for a split second, and I hauled myself out, tumbling onto the wet grass next to Mike. We didn't look back. We sprinted through the woods like hunted animals, tearing our clothes on branches until we burst into our cabin, slamming and locking the door behind us. We huddled in our beds, trembling uncontrollably. We debated waking the head counselor, but the fear of getting in trouble and the fear that no one would believe us kept us silent. We survived the night and boarded the buses home the next morning. But I will never ever forget the feeling of those cold, heavy hands pulling me back into the dark. Attending my very absolutely last camp, catering to kids aged, located deep area. Rumors were dark history. Years ago, Miss Graham, who worked in the camp, had died on the property. Mysterious, undisclosed. The old name to scare the freshmen. Believed in ghosts. Summer. Complete mysticism. Restless nights. Completely evades you. It was hot and stagnant. Words of my fellow campers, tossing and turning violently on the canvas cot. Insomnia was the blind outside. It poured through the large, illuminating the dust mote. Feeling it, I let out an sat up, rubbed my tired eyes. Opened them, my blood instantly. The silver window directly across from my, obstructing the glass, entered into the gloom in my throat, and the details finally registered. Specific, she had deeply a bright, faded red pulled low over her forehead. What the hell is some crazy in the cabins at 3 a.m.? Horror of the situation below. Looking into the cabin, she was looking. Her eyes were wide onto my face with an intense focus. Eased my entire body. Able to handle the terrifying, I violently threw myself facing the wall and yanked it completely over my head. I lay there trembling into the suffocating darkness. For what? Eventually the lens gave me a false. I slowly peeled the blanket back. Empty. The constructed. Shuddering sigh. My racing heart. But as I said, I noticed something strange. Area immediately surrounding me, unnaturally dark, that usually fell across my blanket. I slowly turned, located directly above my. She was there, 3 feet away from my face, a thin pane of glass. Woman in the red cap. Me. Only close to the window, twisted into an extent. I didn't scream, locked up, blanket back over my head, made fetal position, and began praying to God. I must have eventually exhaustion and terror. The morning sighs. I practiced counselor's office the moment I was hysterically described the male county pale. Turned to the 2 female staff. They looked equally. Oh my God, her voice trembling. Like Miss Graham, stopped. Noon. To this day, I don't whole thing out of sleep deprivation, deranged, trespass, or if I had genuine face with the dead. I was 13 years old.
Now remember, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Then subscribe for more horrifying true stories.